welcome to the second video in this Regency costuming adventure series. In this video we will be making the first two undergarments, the chemise and the stays. If you know nothing about fashion history, you may be wondering what is a chemise and what are stays and why are they so important. Here's a brief summary. The chemise, also known as the shift, was the base undergarment which was made of simple shapes like rectangles and triangles and was worn directly against the skin, so the fabric was usually a natural fiber like cotton or linen which absorbed sweat and protected the outer fancy clothes from getting grimy. The stays in the Regency era could be long or short, and the main purpose was to support the torso, much like a corset or bra. Stays were made from cotton and featured strengthening materials like boning and cording. Cording could also be decorative. Now let me show you how I made them. For the shift, I started by cutting out the main body pieces. I started with a trapezoid with the top width being a little past my shoulder length because on Emma's shift, her sleeves start a little bit past the shoulder, and the bottom being 30 inches long. The height was 45 inches, which was also the width of my fabric, and I cut these from some cotton gauze. I then cut gussets from the negative space left from the trapezoid. I changed them so that they would start from mid-thigh. To get the neckline, I pinned my trapezoid to my dress form and marked it out, and then I cut it out on the fold to get a symmetrical neckline. Emma's neckline is more rounded, but I still cut a somewhat square neckline. The shape will be adjustable with drawstring. I sewed the shoulder seams and used a piping foot to sew drawstring into the front half of the neckline. Then I marked with a pin where I wanted my side seams to end a few inches below the armpit. There will be armpit gussets, so take that into consideration. I sewed in my gauze and then the remaining side seam. This is what it should look like. To make the sleeves, I ran a gathering stitch on both ends of two 7-inch by 28-inch rectangles. Then I gathered them into a 13-inch by 3-inch band. The band should be the measurement of your flexed bicep, but make sure to put the fabric around your bicep before you sew it in case that it stretches a little bit. I ended up taking mine in about 2 inches. I folded the band in and ironed it in place, and then after that was all pressed, I stitched it into place on the inside. Next, I pinned a 4x4-inch gusset into the end of my sleeves and sewed it into place. So my shift is nearly complete. I just finished attaching the sleeves, and the next order of business is to take the sleeves in because they were a bit too wide and they kept slipping down and making the sleeves look longer than they should be. So I just clipped a few inches in where I want to sew it, and then I will kind of make like a dart. Same with the other side. And then the last thing I need to do is hem the bottom, and it's got a salvage edge right now, but I need to hem it. I know some Regency shifts are knee length or just below the knee, but in some of my references it looked like Emma's shifts were all kind of ankle length or floor length, so I think I'm going to stick with that. Now for the stays. When patterning my stays, I wanted to keep the pattern simple. I went for some short stays that were 8 inches long and divided my pattern into 3 pieces: the front, the back, and the gussets. The back piece has a 12-inch shoulder strap that comes down and ties in the front. I took measurements from my dress form and made a mock-up which I tried on. I made adjustments as needed. You can take in the waist a little and raise the bust line to achieve that Regency silhouette, which you can't do on a dress form. The purpose of stays and corsets is to achieve a specific shape, by either molding the body fat or by building out the bust and hips with padding. So feel free to play around with the shape a little because the goal is not supposed to be the natural shape of your body, you know, unless your natural body is a Regency silhouette, then good for you. Once I was happy with that pattern, I cut out my pattern pieces and made sure the whole thing was double layered. Apparently that was the first thing I did when I woke up, so excuse the bedhead. And then I took my project into the mountains. I was on vacation, so this isn't a mandatory step. But in the peacefulness of the canyon, I basted my layers together, marked out my gusset lines, and sewed in my gussets. When I returned home, I used a tight zigzag to satin stitch the gussets in place because they looked really raw. On the inside of my stays, I marked out my boning and cording lines and sewed those lines, removing the pad stitching as I went. Then I inserted my cording. This was done by threading my cotton cord to a tapestry needle. My cord was the total length needed to do all the cording so I didn't have to keep rethreading my needle. I worked my needle through the cording channels and pulled the cording all the way through, and snipping it at the end. I had to use pliers to pull my needle through because the channels were pretty tight, and also the needle was a little bit slippery. So, a lot of stays in history have a wooden busk, which is like a long piece of wood that you insert down the front of the stays, and it's kind of about the size of a ruler. So I needed to find a piece of wood that would serve that purpose. And it took me a while to find the right kind of wood because I needed something that would be thick enough that it wouldn't break and so that it would be very strong. But I didn't want it to be too thick, otherwise I'd have this really giant piece of wood in my stays. I went to the Dollar Tree and they have this little craft section where they have wood items that you can paint. And I found this arrow, and it looks like you're supposed to hang it from something. It's about a 1/4 inch thick, and it is also like the perfect size. My busk was 1 inch wide and less than 7 inches long. I used a bottle cap to round the edges, and then I cut out that shape with a bandsaw. If you don't have a saw, you can just buy a wooden ruler, cut it to size, and sand down the ends with sandpaper. Or you can find a really, really big popsicle stick. I inserted the busk and sewed it into place with a piping foot. Next, I put in my boning. I joined the side seams, snipped away one side, and felled it down to create another boning channel. Then I used bias tape to bind all the edges, and I added a drawstring to the top so that I could adjust it as needed. Lastly, I finished my eyelet holes. Here are the finished stays, and the eyelet holes, I think there's 6 on the back, and then there's 2 on the front to attach the straps. These eyelet holes were made by taking my eyelet grommet kit. I used the little hole punch to punch holes, and then I took some double threaded thread and I sat down for 6 hours and watched the 6-hour Pride and Prejudice with my friends, and while I did that I finished the edges with that thread. It was just done by satin stitching around the edges of the holes, and that's it. And that's it. Thank you all so much for watching. If you're new here and you haven't seen my channel before, I make princess dresses and I recreate costumes from movies. So if you think that sounds interesting, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. I can't wait to see you guys in the next video, but until then, have a wonderful day. I finished after that was all pressed. Ugh. Guys, help, please. I'm struggling. Okay, so my chemise is nearly complete. Actually, let me get some more lighting in here. Okay, so I gave myself an entire week to make this shift, and it's day 2, and it's finished. And I'm gonna cut it out using a, what's it called? Is it a bandsaw? A jigsaw? I think it's a jigsaw. No, the bandsaw. And I used the little stamp thingy. What am I saying?